In the last lecture, we saw how we can retrieve our route parameters, and it was working fine, but there are ways to break this. There are cases where this approach will not work, and I will show you a typical example. On our users component, we right now always saw that we have the user ID and name we passed on our URL. Now in here, let me quickly add a router link. So I'll add a horizontal line and then add an anchor tag where I remove the ref and instead say router link. And now I will actually use this syntax with the squared brackets where I pass an array. And I want to load /users, an absolute path to load the correct route. The second element will be the ID. So this might be, let's say 10, could be a number, could be a string. And then the name, let's say Anna. So this will now construct a route which is /users/10/Anna. And this is where this array approach might be better because you can really structure this really well. And we will soon see how you can even make this more dynamic. So here I will say load Anna, ID 10, something like that, any text you like. And now let's see this here. We got this link on our currently loaded page with users free max. And if I click this, you see that the URL was updated. Now it's users 10 Anna, but the text here wasn't. And this is not a bug. This is the default behavior. And what is happening here? Do you have an idea? The behavior here, as I just mentioned, is not a bug. We load our data by using this snapshot object on the route. Now, if we load a new route, what happens? Angular has a look at our app module, finds the fitting route here, hopefully, loads the component, initializes the component, and gives us the data by accessing the snapshot here. Now, that only happens if we haven't been on this component before. But if we click this link, which is on the user component, well, then the URL still changes, but we already are on the component which should get loaded. So Angular, cleverly, doesn't reinstantiate this component. That would only cost us performance. Why would it re-render a component we already are on? Now you might say, because the data we want to load changed. But Angular doesn't know. And it's good that by default, it won't recreate the whole component and destroy the old one if we already are on that component. Still, of course, you want to get access to the updated data. And you can. It's fine to use the snapshot for the first initialization. But to be able to react to subsequent changes, we need a different approach. In our TypeScript code in ng-on-init here, let's say after we assigned this initial setup, we can use our route object, and instead of using the snapshot here, there is some params property on this route object itself. Now we didn't use that before, we had the snapshot in between. What's the difference? Params here is an observable. And now observables is something I will come to right after this section where we will take a closer look. Basically, observables are a feature added by some other third-party package, not by Angular, but heavily used by Angular, which allow you to easily work with asynchronous tasks. And this is an asynchronous task, because the parameters of your currently loaded route might change at some point in the future if the user clicks this link, but you don't know when, you don't know if, and you don't know how long it will take. So therefore, you can't block your code and wait for this to happen here, because it might never happen. So an observable is an easy way to subscribe to some event which might happen in the future, to then execute some code when it happens without having to wait for it now. And that is what params is. It is such an observable, and as the name implies, we can observe it, and we do so by subscribing to it. So you can call the subscribe method on it, and this is still called on params. I'm just bringing it in a new line to make it easier to read. And now subscribe can take three functions you pass here as arguments. Now, the first one is the most important one here. It will be fired whenever new data is sent through that observable So to put it in easier words, whenever the parameters change in this use case. So then this first argument, which should be a function here, is executed. I will use a ES6 arrow function. And here we will get the updated params as an argument. And you can set this of type params. Doesn't really make a difference. It has to be imported from @AngularRouter then though. But anyways, params will always be an object, just like here on the snapshot, which holds the parameters you defined in the route as properties. So in the function body of this arrow function, so of this function which gets executed whenever the parameter changes, here we can now update our user object. And we can say this user ID should now be params ID, referring to the params we passed here. And the same, of course, for the name. Oops, with a semicolon at the end, of course. So this will now update our user object whenever the parameter change. That's why it's inside of this callback and of this anonymous function passed to the subscribe method here. This code will not be executed when ng-on-init runs through. This code here will, so the subscription will be set up, but only if the parameters then change. Only in this case we will exchange them in our user object. That is why with this change in place, if we now go back to free and max, we see free and max is displayed here. But if I now click this link, it correctly updates here too, because our observable fires, and we then retrieve the updated parameters and assign them to our user object. And this therefore actually is the approach you should take to be really safe against changes not being reflected in your template. Now, if you know that the component you're on may never be reloaded from within that component, as we're doing it here, then you might not need this addition. You might simply use the snapshot, because if you know your component will 100% of the time be recreated when it is reached, because there's no other way of reaching it, there is no way of reaching it whilst being on that component. If you know that, you don't need to subscribe. In all other cases, make sure to use this approach to get informed about any changes in your route parameters.